Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of VNext. I'm your host, Mike Walker, and today we're going to dive into the 2020 Emerging Technology Hype Cycle. Yes, the once a year publication that tells us what the heck's going to go on in the future. Uh, this is going to be a really cool episode because we're talking to the man himself, Mr. Brian Burke with Gartner. He is the vice president, research analyst that covers many of these emerging technology trend reports, whether it be the hype cycle for emerging technologies or the top 10 strategic trend report as well. He's definitely got his finger on the pulse of what the heck's happening. And so we talked to him today about the emerging technologies hype cycle specifically, what's new, and frankly, what's different about how these technologies were selected versus previous years. So I think this is going to be incredibly insightful for folks because there are some subtleties that I didn't know, and I used to write the hype cycle. And so it's good to understand from his perspective as the author, what are some key things that you need to understand about why these specific technologies are on here? And maybe equally as important, why some technologies are not on that list. And so we dive into that a bit. But also, I'm excited that we get to hear from Brian on, essentially how to apply this practically, what areas of your business that this applies and when to apply it, all those great questions. So we do a bit of demystification as well around the 2020 emerging technologies hype cycle. Now, like with all of our episodes, all the links and show notes and all that great stuff will be on vnextpod.com. But also, don't forget, because like me, I'll forget if I don't have something subscribed uh, or liked on this channel. So make sure you don't miss out on an episode, and ding that bell and click on subscribe to make sure that you get updated whenever there are new episodes. Because we're going to be talking to some cool people here over the next few weeks. Not that we haven't talked to cool people, because we've talked with some phenomenal people, but we're just going to continue that trend, and we're going to continue to get insights from leaders all around the globe doing interesting things. So, with that, let's get into our interview with Mr. Brian Burke. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
It's going great. I know
Great.
that as a Gartner analyst, your time is extremely valuable, and you've got a lot going on, especially now. Um, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
My
And
pleasure.
and so I know you. We've worked together. We've known each other for years, but the audience may not know you as well. So it'd be good for you to maybe help us understand a little bit, who you are, what your role at Gartner is, and maybe a couple things that people might recognize that are uniquely from you.
Okay. So I'm a research vice president. I've been with Gartner for over 20 years. And my coverage areas are primarily enterprise architecture, as well as emerging and strategic technologies. So I'm based in Europe, in Andorra, which is a tiny little country between Spain and France. And I've been here for a long time, but originally from Canada. You can probably tell by my non-Andorran accent that I'm not originally from here. But um, but yeah, and so those are my coverage areas. Before I joined Gartner, I was a chief architect in an insurance company in Toronto, and did basically every other job in IT before that. And been in IT for 33 years, I think. So yeah, a couple of things about me and research you might know is so we just published the Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies, what we're going to talk about today. I'm also the lead author on the top 10 strategic technology trends, which we're changing this year to the top strategic technology trends, taking away the 10. And also published a book on gamification. It's called Gamify. And so, yeah, a few little bits and bobs about me.
Nice. Yeah. It's phenomenal that as time goes on, the evolution of some of these reports. because they've been around for quite some time. So the emerging technologies hype cycle, how long have we been, or Gartner, how long has Gartner been writing those?
Well, Gartner, we're actually on our 25th year
Wow.
for hype cycles. Now, I tried to check back and didn't find exactly if we published the emerging technologies hype cycle in the first year, but I know we've been publishing hype cycles generally for 25 years. Certainly, the emerging technology hype cycle has been around for at least 15 or 16 years.
Right, right. And obviously we're in the midst of many different non-technical types of activities that are swirling around us, whether it be economic crisis in certain areas of the world, or social unrest, or even a global pandemic. I'm curious, how that has impacted not necessarily the report itself, but how the report is developed. Has there been any changes to the way in which you as a Gartner analyst are now working?
Well, the way actually, so Gartner analysts, the way we work is most Gartner analysts work from home and always have. And so the pandemic didn't change that for in any way, shape, or form. The what did change is that, of course, a lot of Gartner associates are new to working at home, and so that kind of changed things. In terms of the report itself in the pandemic, there clearly are some of the technologies that pop up this year that are very specific to the pandemic. We wouldn't be talking about it if they weren't. So they did have an impact on the technologies that we selected for the emerging technology hype cycle, just in terms of a couple of specific technologies that are on the hype cycle this year that kind of came out of nowhere.
Right, right. Yeah, and definitely noticed there was a couple trends that you identified that correlate directly to the pandemic as well.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
you know, you and I, we've been working in the hype cycle arena for quite some time. There's, some of our listeners are probably, very well in tune with what the hype cycle is and how you should use it. But often what I find is, even though when I do talk to people about the hype cycle, sometimes they get a false impression of what it is and how it should be used. I guess as a bit of demystification, Brian, if maybe you could give us kind of a little bit of a primer on, from your position, what is the emerging technology hype cycle, and ideally, how should clients use that hype cycle?
Okay. So the emerging technologies hype cycle is it's really unique amongst Gartner's hype cycles in that this is the one hype cycle where we are looking across all of Gartner's innovation profiles, and so there's 1,700 of those, and they go on to more than 100 hype cycles. And what we're looking for are what are going to be the most impactful technologies and trends over the next 5 to 10 years. So it has a slightly further planning horizon, as well as it's looking across industries, looking across all kinds of technologies to really gel down to what are the 30 most impactful technologies that our clients need to know about.
And in your mind, for innovators out there, whether you're in academia, whether you're a end user client at a bank or an insurance company or a manufacturing firm, or even like a high tech firm, ideally, how do you see the hype cycle being used, the emerging technology hype cycle being used in practical innovation scenarios?
Right. Well, good question. This is a call I have with clients every day, where the emerging technologies hype cycle is really your starting point into developing your technology radar. So, a technology radar is a tool that you'll use to identify what are the technologies that are most important to your organization. So, you start with the hype cycle for emerging technologies being a key input to that. Other hype cycles could be inputs to that as well for industry specific technologies or regionally specific technologies or technology grouping area specific technologies. So you start with some hype cycles, also augment that with industry research and augment that with information that's coming from universities research organizations, so on and so forth, to find out what are the most important trends and technologies for your organization. And then you distill that down into understanding, well, what is the broad social and business impact of these technologies? And then determine what are the use cases for these technologies. Most technologies have multiple use cases. And so you're looking at, well, what are the potential use cases for these technologies? And that has a lot to do with the hype cycle, because really what happens is the hype is as it goes up to the peak of inflated expectation, we've got all of these potential use cases. So you'll hear a technology can sing, it can dance, it can mop the floor, but then people start using it, and you start to see that, it really doesn't sing very well, it's lousy at dancing, it's okay for mopping the floor, and it goes into the trough of disillusionment. Now, that's actually a good thing, because now we know what it's actually good for. And then it can go up to the plateau of productivity. So use it as the early stage input to your emerging technologies radar, to really understand what are the technologies that are coming up that are going to be impactful, identify what those use cases are, then match those use cases to opportunities in your organization, create business scenarios, and track those business scenarios into the future when the technology is mature enough to deploy in that business scenario. So that's really the overall process. And then, of course, you put the business scenario onto a roadmap, and you have an innovation portfolio.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. And if I parroted this back to you and see how close I'm getting here in my own words, Brian, what it sounds like, what you're saying is the emerging technologies hype cycle is really one of the key prerequisites to many other downstream enterprise processes. Your corporate innovation strategy, when you're looking at long range over the next few years, that's going to be a critical input. But even before that, when you go into your innovation management and open innovation management activities, where you're doing your trend spotting and you're trying to contextualize the market in ways in which make sense to your business and the outcomes your business wants to achieve, this is a critical input to one, accelerate those efforts by leveraging Gartner to do a lot of the research for you to as an input for you to contextualize, because it doesn't give you the answer. What it does is it gives you the raw data to understand the market, to then,
That's
so
it.
you as a professional and your team, to contextualize that in your own trend spotting initiatives. You can take that as like the essentially the atlas for you to go to other resources as well. Like you'd mentioned academia, forums, big evil vendors, lots of different sources where you can get this knowledge, but it can really serve as a catalyst, an atlas to be able to navigate this complex emerging technologies world. Am I getting that right? Am I close to the mark?
That's that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So we do a lot of the legwork, basically, to say, what are the technologies that are out there? We've got, as you know, hundreds of analysts that are looking at these things, and so we've got a really good idea of what are the technologies that are out there, and then we, put those onto our hype cycles, and that's really a starting point for people to, as you say, contextualize that for their industry and their organization. What is the impact of these technologies going to be?
Right. And another misconception that I hear often is if a technology is on the far left hand side of the hype cycle, then that means we shouldn't do anything with that technology. Yeah, is in your mind, is that true or not, and why?
Um, some technologies you probably should be keeping an eye on many technologies, even if they're not ready for commercial deployment yet. But actually, do things spend money on a technology? For a lot of the technologies, not a lot, but for some of the technologies, no, it wouldn't be advisable to start spending money on them right now. So if you're looking at technologies, let's say like quantum computing, which is still very much in the labs and looks like it will be for a while, I'd certainly be paying attention to how that technology is evolving, but I'd be hesitant to spend real money on that technology at this point in time until we have some proven use cases.
Right. And another factor that I often tell the folks that I work with is it really depends on how aggressive you want to be with your innovation strategy, the competitive dynamics in your particular market space. So you might have an early stage technology, let's say like quantum computing, and you might define, hey, we've got to go into this highly competitive market and really differentiate ourselves. And we're willing to innovate and invest and take risks and potentially fail, and that's okay to fail. But looking at that technology as a business differentiator, that's okay. It's how I look at the hype cycle is what it does is it calibrates your expectations on where this technology is, both in its life cycle and what we hear as far as what the promise could be in the marketplace. But we haven't got to a point yet where that has proven itself out, because you haven't got to the trough of disillusionment quite
Yeah,
yet.
yeah.
Is that in line with how you think about it as well?
That's exactly right. These are, all early stage technologies, and so we're still learning a lot about them. If we look at the hype cycle for emerging technologies, there's very few that are over that peak of inflated expectations. And there are a few with various reasons. So they're all early stage technologies that are evolving, and the technologies that we want to at least be watching, but it also be planning for the deployment of, and in some cases, actually going ahead with pilots and proof of concepts. If that technology is aligned with an opportunity for your organization that's going to drive significant competitive advantage.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, for this year's hype cycle, what were, we talked about the pandemic as one of the factors for the development of it. I'm curious, were there other factors specifically that really drove the selection of those 1700 technologies? Every year it slightly changes. When I was at Gartner, I think it was 2000 technologies. So you
Yeah.
guys have whittled that down a little bit, but
We've whittled it down a bit. Yeah.
so, so has the criteria changed at all? And were there specific, either technical or non-technical factors that influence this year's hype cycle?
Well, the criteria changed quite a bit over the last 2 years. So last year, for the hype cycle, we made a conscious decision that we wanted to retire some of the technologies that were perennial favorites on the hype cycle. So we had, smart dust, which was on the hype cycle for 6 years. We had quantum computing, which was on the hype cycle for 13 years. It became a teenager on the hype cycle. And basically, as we have these technologies that are perennial favorites on the hype cycle, given we've got limited real estate to introduce new technologies, we thought it's better to have a technology highlighted on the hype cycle that hasn't been highlighted before for our clients than simply have these most important perennial favorites. So when they get off the hype cycle, like quantum computing did last year and smart dust did last year, it doesn't mean that those technologies cease to become important. What it means is that we are making room for other technologies to be highlighted on the hype cycle. And so we've really changed the process in terms of how we select those technologies as well. So what we do now is we go through, first of all, from the 1,700, yes, a few less than when you were still with Gartner, but from that 1,700, we go through first and set the criteria for the impact of that technology and the planning horizon to the plateau of productivity and that kind of thing. And we cut that down to about 150 technologies on our short list. And then we actually have our emerging technologies research community vote on that short list. So we have the short list, then the research community, about a dozen people, vote on the short list, and then we look at the voting. And what we do at that point is we apply a formula that effectively disadvantages technologies that have been on the hype cycle before, advantages technologies that have never been on any hype cycle before. And so we're making a conscious decision to see what is fresh and what is important And that's what gets graduated to the 30 or so technologies on the hype cycle.
Nice. So yeah, obviously the process, like you said, changed quite a bit, and definitely see, lots of really positive advantages to that. But also there is some drawbacks, and so for folks, like you had said, these technologies that have been on the hype cycle are the perennial favorites, right? Um, where do people go to find that information? Are there specific hype cycles that they could go to then see where smart dust and nanotechnology is, or quantum?
Yeah. So remember that the hype cycle for emerging technologies is an aggregation from all the other hype cycles. And so we don't have standalone innovation profiles or technologies on the hype cycle. So they always exist someplace else. So, excuse me, what we did this year is so this year we have 30 technologies on the hype cycle. We retired 27, we kept three. And so there was three that were important enough that they made it through to their second year on the hype cycle. What we did in the document itself was we talk about the technologies that are off the hype cycle. We say, if you want to look at that technology hype cycle, look here. If you want that one, look here. So we referenced all of the previous year's technologies onto the different hype cycles where they're really core on that hype cycle.
Right. So essentially, what you're doing, if I understand you correctly, Brian, is you're applying essentially you're eliminating the hype from the hype cycle, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Well, yeah, eliminating the hype from the hype cycle. I guess you could put it that way. What we're doing is we're really um, shifting the focus from the hype cycle. So let me say, shifting the focus from the 30 most important emerging technologies that you need to know about to the 30 most important emerging technologies that you've never heard of. And
Yeah.
so that's really how it's going.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so that's really good to hear, because it's when I read the hype cycle over the past couple of years, it wasn't as obvious, the point that you made. So I think people are really gonna kind of light bulbs are gonna start to go off, where people go, oh, okay, that's why that technology isn't on here, and that's why some of these are on there. So that's good. Now, you had mentioned that there is this voting process by other analysts within your emerging technologies community. Is there any criteria that they use to select what these technologies should or shouldn't be on the list?
Well, we give them the criteria, and basically we let them assess the technologies. So the criteria is that these technologies, the ones that are supposed to be selected or voted most highly, the analysts will look at as having the most significant cross-industry impact for business and/or society. And so that's the criteria.
Mm,
It's what is the most significant business and societal impact for these technologies. And so then there's no formula. They look at those technologies, they understand what they are, they read through the profiles, they understand the technologies, and they say, yes, I think this is going to be huge, or I think this is not going to be so big. And so at the end of the day, it's a purely subjective assessment. But when you have the subjective assessment of a dozen experts, you get a pretty good result.
yeah, and I think the important thing to note here, that folks might not intuitively kind of tune into here is, you had said earlier, you said, Mike, we don't invent any of the dots on the hype cycle. Those dots are actually coming from subject matter experts that deal day in and day out with those technology profiles, or the dots on the hype cycle. And so you're getting this feedback not from theorists or generalists. I'm sure there's probably some of that in the pool, but you're actually going to the experts that understand reinforcement learning or quantum, or whatever the technology profile you may be looking at, but you're going directly to the experts. So while there isn't a defined scientific formulaic method. You are going to the experts to get highly qualifiable information, is what I'm hearing.
Well, that's exactly right. Because what ends up, of course, the excuse me, the hype cycle is dots, so innovation profiles. But those innovation profiles are written by the experts that are deeply steeped in those technologies. And so the selection process, we're using people who are really good at generalist understanding of technologies. So they're all very broad. They may be deep in one or two things, but they're all very broad. And they're the people who are doing the selection. The people who are writing the innovation profiles are very deep in at least that one topic. And so that is where we're getting the information from.
Right. Now you'd mentioned in the selection criteria, you had said that there. Well, what you want to understand is what is the impacts of this technology on society and on businesses. Um, I guess as you were going through this process, Brian, were there specific business or societal trends that heavily influenced the hype cycle outside the pandemic? That's an easy one. But were there
Yeah.
other ones that affected the hype cycle this year?
There was certainly, one of the sort of trends that we identified was what we call composite architectures. And that's really, there's a couple of technologies that are in there that we talked about using, creating a composable enterprise. And we do that using packaged business capabilities, which are, you can think of chunks of functionality that we can cobble together through APIs and build that on top of a data fabric that allows us to, rapidly reconfigure the services that we're offering in IT or customize those services for individual users. So, certainly that's going to have a significant impact. If we had that before the pandemic, as a lot of organizations had to respond to, completely changed business environment, those organizations that could rapidly reconfigure their organization, they had that quality of plasticity, they did well. And so those are, some of the things that we're highlighting. Also, there's all of these trends are really important, but one whole sort of theme is what we call formative AI. And with formative AI, we got a number of technologies in there. And really the glue that holds them together is that this is AI that can change and be even creative. And so most AI models use supervised learning techniques primarily, and you train a model, you feed it a lot of training data, you create a model, a static model, you test it, and then you put it in production, and it stays like that. But with adaptive machine learning, then that is continuing to learn over time, or with things like generative artificial intelligence, we can create entirely new models, so new things that we haven't had before. So I'm not talking about new AI models. I'm talking about new models for parts, or new models for molecules, or new models for drug compounds. And those are the kinds of things that we can create where we've never been able to create those before. So this whole notion of formative AI is really about how AI is becoming more dynamic, even to the point of being creative. And so, yeah, there's certainly a lot of things that outside the pandemic have some significant impact, but inside the pandemic as well. Things like health passports. Health passport is a fairly simple technology on the front end. It's a QR code on your phone that allows you, in certain places, it allows you access to public transportation, flights, trains, office buildings, government buildings, your apartment building, supermarket, restaurant. You've got to show a green health code in China, for instance, to get into many of these places. It's starting to be used in India as well. And because those are the two biggest countries in the world by population, and because you can't really move around without one, these health passports, we estimate that there's a 20% market penetration. in a technology that didn't exist 3 months ago. And so
Right.
that's kind of amazing. I'm overstating 3 months because it's been around a little longer in China. So let's say six.
Right.
Um, that's kind of amazing in terms of technology penetration.
Well,
Um,
Brian, time flies in a pandemic, so
yeah,
3 months, 6 months, 12 months, it's
yeah,
just just flying
exactly.
by.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. So I'm a co-inventor on a patent with GE Aviation, where we actually created a health pass solution
Oh,
for traveling. So whether
oh,
it's
okay.
rail, air, you know, public transportation, whatever it may be, we partnered with GE Healthcare and many other both federal and nonprofit organizations to be able to do exactly what you're saying. And so I agree, and I think that it's going to be part of our future, whether we whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that interesting just on that, I'm having conversations with large airport authorities and things like that. People are getting prepared for this because um, we're going to open up at some point, and we need to have open up as safely as possible. And so there needs to be some way of or some indication that a person is lower risk or higher risk. So while this is really taken off in China and India, I think it's coming to the rest of the world probably fairly soon. I know I'm going to Germany in a week and a half. I have to get a test before I go. As more and more places are asking for testing, a health passport makes more and more sense.
Yes. Now, so we talked about what is the hype cycle, kind of debunking some of the misconceptions, some of the criteria going into it. Another aspect that you had mentioned, Brian, is that the focus of the emerging technologies hype cycle is 5 to 10 years out and the most impactful technologies. Now, when you look at the hype cycle, uh, there's a lot of technologies or dots on the hype cycle that are either now to 2 to 5 years. So why are some of those technologies on this list?
Yeah, some of these technologies, like health passports and
Yep.
social distancing technologies, we see are going to hit the plateau of productivity in less than 2 years. And so, some of these technologies, let me say that that's not an absolute hard and fast rule. The I guess the when push comes to shove, business impact wins. And so, even
Right.
if it's not 5 to 10 years out, like you say, things are happening fast in a pandemic. The impact, in this case, health passports and social impact and business impact is huge. And so, yeah, it's something that we want to raise awareness about in our client base.
Yeah, I asked that very deliberately because I was asked
Mm.
that question all the time. They're like, wait a second here, guys, why did you do that? And, how I responded back then, and you've responded in a similar way, is one, these are important technologies for businesses to understand as they start to roadmap out their radars, their emerging technology radars, number one. But number two, a lot of these technologies are foundational or lead to the more bleeding edge technologies out there, and you need to master some of these technologies that may be in the 2 to 5 year range that help us get as a stepping stone to get us to some of those more advanced technologies. And so that's how I looked at it and how I currently look at it, whether that's right or wrong. But I guess, do you look at it in a similar way?
I do. I do. I mean, those are there are general guidelines in terms of the time frame to reach plateau of productivity and those kinds of things. But we're really looking at overall what is the most important technologies that we need to highlight to our clients. And so we can bend those rules a little bit. They're not hard and fast rules.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And, in a lot of ways, we have to be somewhat nimble when it comes to any sort of future prediction of any sort, because we know that no matter what, we're going to get it wrong. It's just we want to be as close to right as possible.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Plausibly right.
Plausibly right. And so in that vein, I mean, when you went through this process, were there specific technologies that you were like, "Wow, I'm really excited about these sets of technology"? Were there things in the hype cycle this year that really got you excited?
The probably that class of technologies that I mentioned earlier, generative AI, are the technologies that excite me most. You know, so when I was in college learning about computers 35 years ago, I was shocked to hear that computers couldn't generate a true random number. And so, so computers can do things very well and do them fast, but they're not very creative. And I think that these technologies, that have a certain level of creativity to them are tremendously exciting. So these technologies, so there's generative adversarial networks, there's variational autoencoders, there's reinforcement learning. They all have this ability to create new stuff. And these technologies, are really taking an optimized search towards a target, and being very creative in doing that, and that to me is just mind blowing. So I think that there is a ton of opportunity out there.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's something that from some of my work that I'm doing on my team, we've got a heavy focus on those technologies, reinforcement learning, with Project Bonsai and lots of other stuff, but also some of the outputs, the products of these new algorithms, like synthetic data,
Yeah.
the creation of new data that didn't exist before. And so that's incredibly interesting, and all the new applications of that, but also applying the ethics side of the house on top of that as well,
Mhm.
starts to get really interesting on what we should and shouldn't do.
Ethics is becoming more and more of a question in IT, and a lot of the technologies, or some of the technologies that we're highlighting this year as well, are related to ethics and things like differential privacy, where we're using algorithms to basically encrypt data so that we can do operations on it, but doesn't have to be encrypted, and that kind of stuff. So privacy and ethics comes into so many conversations these days around technology. It's stunning.
Right. And so we'd mentioned a couple trends. So you had mentioned formative AI. You had mentioned composite. Was it applications?
Composite architecture is the
Composite
broad.
architectures. What are
Yeah.
some of the other trends that you identified with this hype cycle?
Well, we talked about beyond silicon. So as we all know, we're running into the physical limits of silicon, and as we move beyond silicon, we're looking at technologies like DNA compute and storage, or carbon-based transistors. Those are or even biodegradable sensors. Those are some of the technologies that we're looking at. Another one is algorithmic trust. And so what that's about is really shifting our trust models away from a centralized authority, trusted centralized authority, to more algorithmic trust. Now, algorithmic trust is really the basis of blockchain, but algorithms, aren't limited to blockchain in terms of this algorithmic trust notion. And so, as I mentioned, differential privacy, it uses algorithms to maintain privacy on data, not using necessarily blockchain. But we've got other things in there that do use blockchain, like authenticated provenance and others. And then the final trend is digital me. In digital me, we are talking about a digital representation of ourselves, or those technologies that are enabling us. We've got all kinds of weird and wonderful technologies in there, like a citizen twin or
Right.
digital twin of a person. That's where health passports live, social distancing technologies, and two-way brain-machine interfaces. So that's a really fascinating technology as well. There's been lots on the news about it this week, as Elon Musk's company unveiled their bidirectional brain-machine interface, and it's we've had Reed brain-machine interfaces for a while, so you could read brain waves to, say, control a prosthetic arm. But writing to the brain, where you can actually alter the brain state, change moods, help people sleep, manage pain, is all brand new. And so raising lots of ethical questions as well.
And so where do some of those ethical or moral uh, challenges get addressed in some of the Gartner reporting? So we identify it in the emerging technologies hype cycle, but is there links to responsible and ethical AI type of topics? Is that covered at all?
Ethics is covered. Gartner, we're ultimately a technology company. So we are not an ethics company, but we do cover ethics from the point of, how do you have to consider technologies in terms of, the ethical position or the ethical use of technologies? How do you put in place the appropriate ethics committees and that for advice on the ethical impact of technologies? But we don't generally make judgments about technology, the ethical use of technologies. That's not our area of expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you had defined some trends as part of the emerging technologies hype cycle. Now there's also similar reports where there's trends that are identified. The one that comes to mind, I think, in a lot of people's heads are the top 10 strategic trend reports that come out every year.
Yeah.
How different or similar are the trends identified in the emerging technologies hype cycle to the top 10 strategic trends?
Okay. So the trends that we talk about, well, the trends. Let me talk about the technologies. So the technologies on the emerging technology hype cycle are discrete technologies. We group those into trends, and that's a bottom-up effort where we're saying, okay, well, what's the glue between these technologies? What's really happening here? And that's grouped into a trend. And so we talked about those 5 trends. And we have, with the hype cycle for emerging technologies, most of those technologies are going to have a further in the future timeline than for these top 10 strategic technology trends. So for the top 10, it's a different approach. Really, in the top 10, it's looking at aggregates of technologies rather than discrete technologies. And so if you look at a top 10 trend from last year, it was multi-experience, where we're talking about augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, changing the way you perceive the virtual world, and then changing the way you interact with the virtual world with conversational interfaces, haptics, and gesture control, and those kinds of things. So each one of those technologies is discrete technology, the VR and AR and those kinds of things, but they're grouped into together in a trend we call multi-experience. So in the top 10 strategic technology trends, what you're going to see is that more general view of where technology is going generally. So multi-experience, as an example, changes the way we interact with the virtual world. That is going to be comprised of a number of discrete technologies, whereas the hype cycles are discrete technologies. So that's really the difference.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, and I think that kind of helps folks when they look at these reports decipher when and how to use each one.
Mhm.
Um, so I want to be very respectful of your time, Brian. We've gone over a little bit, and I am extremely grateful that you've spent the time with us here today. But as we start to wrap up, what are some of the top things that you, in the spirit of top, whatever's, what are some of the top things you want people to take away from this conversation that we've talked about so far?
Well, what I want people to take away is that from this conversation is that um, their technology is constantly changing, and it's extraordinarily difficult to keep up with technology change. Technologies ultimately have a massive impact on our organizations, and so what you need to do is really to take a structured approach with inputs like the hype cycle for emerging technologies to really understand what those technologies are and then be able to understand the impact on your organization or potential impacts, plan for when those technologies in a use case will become mature, so that you don't get blindsided by technologies that your competitors have adopted and you're unaware of. And so technology planning is important. Um, get a head start with the Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies and lots of other sources to plan for what's your innovation portfolio going to contain over the next 2 to 3 years.
No, makes total sense. And what I've taken away from this conversation is a lot of demystification of when and how to use the hype cycle. The process has evolved over time, and the latest incarnation of the hype cycle is really focused on some of the technologies that may not get as much attention because of other brighter shining stars out there. We talked about quantum and blockchain and autonomous and all these other things, but really taking a deliberate effort to make sure that people are aware of some of these other technologies that otherwise with the previous criteria would not get highlighted, but also going through the process of how it's selected, and really leveraging and standing on the shoulders of giants of these experts that are working in these technologies day in day out. And when we say working in these technologies, what we mean is one, they're taking all the inquiry calls every single day, talking to clients about their challenges and issues. They're talking to vendors and all the other related aspects of this, and then tapping into innovators, futurists, strategic thinkers to really distill based on what is going to be most impactful to businesses, applying that depth and saying, okay, well, these are the ones that broadly folks should care about. And so that's what I've taken away from the conversation. Hopefully, that's kind of helped demystify a little bit more the emerging technologies hype cycle for folks. Now, for folks that may want to yell at you or beat you up for removing their favorite technology, um,
Yeah.
or give you wild praise, so we don't want to just lead with a negative, but for
Yeah.
folks that have genuine questions around some of the technologies or how to use this within, like you said, you focus on enterprise architecture and innovation management. So obviously we weren't able to get into that area a whole lot and how this really helps contribute to those processes. But if people have additional questions and want to reach out, whether it's through you directly or another proxy, how can people do that?
Well, let me say for Gartner clients, the best way to do that is through inquiry. So go to your Gartner account representative and say you want to speak to me, and tell them what you want to speak to about. Or you can go online and do that online as well. If you're not a Gartner client, you're welcome to send me an email. It's brian.burke@gartner.com, and let me say I'll try to get to it. I can't promise, but I will try. Interesting questions get answered first. Let me put it that way.
There you go. Well, listen, Brian, I sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your extremely busy day, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on again and talk about some of the other stuff you're working on.
Absolutely. Love to do it again, Mike.